used to think that feeling sorry for yourself was just a waste of calories you couldn't afford to lose. That was my baseline philosophy when I was clocking out of the emergency room at 3 in the morning, staring at a gas gauge that was hovering dangerously close to empty. I was 31 years old, working 3 separate jobs, and doing the kind of desperate mental math that forces you to choose between a gallon of fuel or a decent meal. I was an air nurse by night, an independent agency worker by weekend, and a certified nursing assistant instructor by day. I had convinced myself that drowning in silence was just the price you paid for independence. A wall I built around myself brick by brick until asking for help felt completely impossible. That everything I thought I knew about my own life shattered on a Sunday evening during my grandfather's birthday dinner. My family was gathered around the roast, radiating the kind of effortless wealth that I always assumed came from hard work and good luck. My sister Clara was practically glowing from her latest vacation to Ciabio, a designer bag slung over her chair that literally cost more than my entire car. Her husband Julian was holding court about his latest investment strategies, looking like a man who had never faced a real consequence in his life. My mother looked at my wrinkled scrubs, sighed heavily, and told me I always chose to look so incredibly hard done by. I just swallowed the insult, because letting things go was a muscle I had severely overdeveloped. Then my grandfather, a rugged 80-year-old, who had poured concrete before building a massive construction empire, walked into the dining room. He bypassed everyone else, wrapped his heavy arms around me, and squeezed me so tightly my spine snapped back into alignment. When he pulled away, his eyes were brimming with a strange, private pride that I couldn't quite decipher. He looked at me intently and whispered that it put his mind at ease to see how beautifully I was taking care of myself. I forced a laugh, entirely confused by the statement, because I was a woman who routinely reheated gas station coffee to save $2. Before I could ask what he meant, Clara called us to the table, and my mother's hand quickly gripped his arm, steering him away just a bit too fast. We were halfway through the main course when my grandfather set his fork down, looked across the table at me, and asked the question that would crack my entire world wide open. He smiled warmly and asked how that monthly check was treating me. I assumed he was just making polite small talk about my meager nursing salary, so I told him the hospital paid what it paid, and I was getting by. Across the table, my mother set her water glass down with a sharp, heavy thud and instantly pivoted the conversation toward Clara's latest wedding client. It was a flawless, rapid distraction, the kind of defensive maneuver you only notice when your instincts tell you a patient's vital signs are starting to drop. My grandfather, however, wasn't quite ready to let the topic go. He smiled again, mentioning that he still kept the beautiful thank you card I had sent him the previous month stuck right to his refrigerator door. He praised my handwriting, calling it the absolute best in the entire family. I froze, my fork suspended in mid-air, because I hadn't sent him a card the previous month, or the month before that, or even the year before that. I opened my mouth to correct him, but my mother instantly stood up, firmly grabbing his elbow and pulling him toward the living room to look at dog photos. The conversational door slammed shut, leaving me sitting there in the sudden silence with a knot tightening in my stomach. The next morning, the postal service delivered the definitive proof that I wasn't just exhausted. I was being systematically robbed. A thick official envelope arrived at my apartment, sent from a prominent accounting firm I had never interacted with in my life. The letter used dry, clinical tax language to outline the substantial annual gifts made to me on behalf of my grandfather, Arthur Harley. The final figure, detailed in those documents, made me sit down directly on my linoleum kitchen floor. According to the Internal Revenue paperwork, I had been gifted $84,000 over the last 12 months alone. I read the text 4 times, my nurse's brain analyzing the data, and realized someone was claiming I received 3 times my actual salary while I broke my body on night shifts. My immediate reaction wasn't to break down and cry. It was to systematically verify the records. I pulled up 4 years of digital bank statements on my phone, scanning every single transaction line by line the way. I would review a critical medication list. There was absolutely nothing there. No large deposits, no mystery transfers, not even a partial payment. Whatever wealth my grandfather believed he was sending to support his granddaughter had vanished long before it ever reached my account. I called my mother that evening, forcing my voice to remain completely casual, and asked if Grandpa had ever routed any funds to me through her. There was a terrible, agonizing silence on the line before she softly told me I was working myself sick and needed to go to sleep. I hung up the phone and stared at the tax document, realizing I had just been expertly gaslit by the very woman who raised me. The next evening, I stood before my class of 12 CNA students, teaching them the exact mechanics of taking a manual blood pressure reading. My hands performed the demonstration flawlessly, but my mind was entirely consumed by the staggering mathematics of the fraud. I instructed the students to always count the pulse before they reacted, repeating the advice my father had given me before he passed away. When he died, I was completely devastated, leaving my mother to manage the estate, the accounts, and the legal paperwork. I had trusted the strongest grief in the room to be the most honest, blindly signing every single page she placed in front of me. A week later, my mother asked me to help her organize the spare bedroom, and I accepted the invitation solely because I needed access to that house. While she was busy brewing coffee in the kitchen, I sat down at her desk where her personal laptop was left entirely open to her banking portal. I didn't hesitate. I began scrolling through her recent financial history. The pattern was as regular as a steady heartbeat. $7,000 deposited on the first of every single month. Right beneath those deposits, within 24 hours, was an outgoing transfer of the exact same amount to an account, ending in 4 specific digits. My heart hammered against my ribs as I recognized those digits from a check Clara had given me months ago for a shared gift. The money was coming into my mother's possession and immediately being funneled directly into my sister's account. I snapped photos of the glowing screen with my phone, my hands completely steady despite the adrenaline surging through my system. But as I closed the laptop, I realized a digital photograph of a maternal account proved absolutely nothing in a legal sense. I had no authority to demand records from a financial institution that didn't even know my name. Just then, Claire's icy voice cut across the room, demanding to know exactly what I was doing on our mother's computer. I simply smiled, told her I was looking for extra packing tape, and went back to folding old curtains while my soul turned cold. I refused to scream at my sister because I had spent years watching families destroy their own cases in the emergency room by losing their tempers. Instead, I went home and constructed a clinical, meticulous file containing the IRS notices, the dates, the amounts, and the photographs of the screen. I laid the papers out on my kitchen table like a medical chart for a patient who was being quietly poisoned by their own caregivers. The legal reality was a brick wall. The money traveled from Arthur to my mother, and then directly to Clara. Every single link in that fraudulent chain belonged to someone else's bank, someone else's signature, and someone else's personal account. I desperately needed professional intervention, so I scheduled an appointment with a free legal aid clinic. The attorney, Evelyn Vance, sat in a cramped office surrounded by heavy legal binders, listening to my narrative with absolute patience. She explained that if someone was signing my name on the back of those checks to deposit them, it constituted a forged endorsement. The front of the check appeared entirely authentic, which was why the financial institution never flagged the transactions as suspicious. When I eagerly asked how we could obtain copies of those physical checks, Evelyn shook her head, explaining the agonizing trap. Because I wasn't the account owner or the payer, only the issuer of the checks, my grandfather, or law enforcement could legally compel the bank to produce those images. Evelyn looked at me seriously and added that if my signature had been falsified to redirect funds, this was no longer a simple family dispute. In our state, falsifying a legal signature to acquire property constituted criminal forgery, a serious felony. I drove home realizing that to uncover the truth, I had to get to my grandfather, but my mother had spent 4 years guarding him like a sentry. 2 days later, my mother called with a bright, cheerful voice, asking me to handle the floral arrangements for his upcoming 80th birthday party. She told me I was always so wonderful with the small details, entirely unaware that she was handing me the perfect stage. Every single relative witness, an old friend would be gathered in one single room, where the truth could not be edited. I agreed to the assignment, but I knew I couldn't walk into that dining room without my grandfather's explicit cooperation. I tried calling his home multiple times, but my mother intercepted every single call, claiming he was either resting or out with old acquaintances. Recognizing her tactics, I wrote a physical letter in my own genuine handwriting and personally dropped it into his mailbox while her car was gone. I asked him to meet me for coffee, just the two of us, because there was something vital we needed to discuss in person. 3 days of agonizing silence passed before my phone finally rang from an unlisted number. It was my grandfather, calling secretly from a friend's house, his voice heavy with an old man's distinct, lingering hurt. We met in a secluded back booth at a local diner, and I did the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I told him his daughter was a thief. I placed a copy of a single check on the table, a document I have managed to obtain because it bore his name as the payer. The front showed his steady handwriting authorizing $7,000 to Grace Anderson. But when he turned it over, his face drained of color. On the back was my name, penned in a looping, theatrical script that looked absolutely nothing like my actual handwriting. He stared at the forgery, then pulled a worn birthday card from his wallet that featured the exact same falsified script. He realized the loving thank you notes he cherished were complete fabrications. My grandfather's hands slammed against the table, his jaw tightly set as he demanded we drive to my mother's house immediately to confront her. I placed my hand over his trembling fingers and gently told him no, because a private confrontation would only result in tears and excuses. If she cornered him alone, she would manipulate his emotions until he doubted the very evidence staring him in the face. I offered him a strategic plan instead, asking him to sign the legal paperwork allowing Evelyn to formally request 4 years of endorsement records. He looked at me with a mixture of profound sorrow and intense pride, agreeing that he had never been afraid of the truth. We shook hands on the agreement, solidifying our alliance in that quiet diner booth. The subsequent weeks were an exercise in absolute discipline, as we waited for the financial institutions to process the formal requests. Clara texted me constantly about color schemes for the party, and I replied with cheerful emojis while maintaining a completely normal exterior. Then, just 10 days before the event, Evelyn called my cell phone, her voice noticeably altered as she informed me the records had arrived. I locked myself inside an empty hospital supply closet and opened the secure digital files she transferred to my device. The documentation was a comprehensive map of a 4-year criminal operation. Every single check had been deposited via mobile, captured directly into a joint account owned by Clara and Julian. But the financial records weren't even the most devastating part of the disclosure. The correspondence file contained something far more sinister. Over the years, the accounting firm had received several letters written in my forged handwriting, updating my grandfather on my fictional life. One specific letter, dated 2 years prior, explicitly asked him to increase the monthly allowance from $5,000 to $7,000. The text claimed that I was enrolling in an expensive nurse practitioner program and desperately needed the extra tuition assistance. Someone had used my identity and my grandfather's genuine affection for me to negotiate a raise on their own ongoing theft. It was the definitive proof of calculating long-term criminal intent. On the evening of the celebration, 14 family members sat around a long table, illuminated by soft candlelight and the fragrance of the blush roses I had arranged. Clara was dressed in an exquisite gown, acting as the elegant hostess of an event funded entirely by my stolen livelihood. Julian moved gracefully around the room, refilling wine glasses with an easy, untroubled smile. My mother sat directly at my grandfather's right hand, radiating the comfortable authority of the woman who supposedly managed the family. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, a slim manila folder resting silently in my lap. I watched them interact, realizing I was the only person in the room who recognized the elegant dinner party was actually a crime scene. My grandfather suddenly tapped his spoon against his glass, silencing the ambient chatter, and stood up to deliver his remarks. He looked down the length of the table, his eyes locking onto mine, and asked the familiar question about how his checks were treating me. The extended family chuckled warmly, viewing it as a sweet, repetitive grandfatherly quirk. My mother's expression instantly froze into a rigid defensive mask, her eyes darting toward Clara. I calmly set my wine glass down, reached into my folder, and placed 3 physical check copies directly into the center of the table. I announced clearly that my grandfather had been sending $7,000 a month for 4 years, but I had never received a single dollar. My mother's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she sharply told me this was entirely inappropriate and that I was clearly confused. I simply told the table to turn the documents over, my voice carrying perfectly across the sudden, absolute silence of the dining room. My grandfather reached down, flipped the pages, and displayed the looping, falsified signatures to the entire gathering. He read the destination account number aloud, turned his gaze directly toward my sister, and asked if that belonged to her. Clara's face turned completely white as 14 relatives stared at her in stunned, unblinking silence. She looked at our mother, then at the evidence, and utterly failed to offer a single word of defense. Clara completely lost her composure, leaping to her feet so violently, her chair shattered against the hardwood floor as she began screaming insults at me. She called me a miserable, ungrateful nurse, shouting that the money would have just rotted in the bank because I never spent anything on myself. My mother dissolved into frantic, rehearsed tears, reaching for my grandfather's arm and sobbing that she only did it to prevent a foreclosure on the family home. I remained perfectly still in my chair, allowing their chaotic noise to completely validate the evidence I had laid out. When they finally ran out of breath, I looked at my mother and asked her to produce the loan documents she had claimed existed. The silence that followed was absolute, a total admission of guilt that no amount of crying could ever erase. My grandfather raised his hand, commanding silence with a single word, and looked at my mother with a cold, unyielding disappointment. He told her he had grieved my apparent distance for years, believing I simply couldn't be bothered to call him while cashing his checks. Then the quiet attorney sitting at the table spoke up, noting that forging signatures to intercept negotiable instruments constituted a clear felony under state law. I closed my folder, stood up from the table, and informed them that I didn't require an apology, only a full restitution of the funds. I walked out of that house and drove home through the darkness, experiencing the profound, hollow calm that always follows a crisis. The final forensic investigation revealed the total amount of diverted funds was just over $278,000. A formal legal settlement was established, secured directly against my mother's real estate and the remaining assets of my sister's failing business. The state prosecutor accepted the case, and both my mother and sister are currently facing an active criminal investigation for forgery and grand theft. My grandfather immediately altered his estate structure, routing the funds directly to my personal account and establishing a nursing scholarship in my late father's honor. I finally resigned from the grueling weekend agency position, choosing to keep teaching simply because I love educating the next generation of caregivers. For the first time in nearly a decade, I am sleeping through the night without waking up to check my banking balances. I no longer maintain a relationship with my mother or sister, preferring to let our interaction exist solely through legal intermediaries. I didn't cut them out of my life out of malice. I simply removed their unfettered access to my name, my silence, and my money. On my refrigerator, I keep a copy of that forged check to remind myself that protecting what you earn isn't cruelty. It is simply the price you pay to finally live your life in complete peace. Share your opinion by dropping comments. Please like and subscribe my channel if you loved your girlfriend.